Okay, welcome back, everyone. Just a quick announcement: we'll have an hour for workshops after this panel. So good afternoon, welcome if you happen to the University of Texas at Austin, in case you haven't been welcomed already. I'd like to introduce to you our next moderator, Mr. Greg Lindsay. Greg is a generalist, urbanist, futurist, and speaker. He is an urban tech fellow at Cornell and the Chief Communications Officer of Climate Alpha, a startup steering investment to more climate-resilient regions. He is also a senior fellow for applied research and foresight at New Cities, a senior fellow at MIT's Future Urban Collectives Lab, and a non-resident senior fellow of the Atlantic Council's Scowcroft Strategy Initiative. Hope you enjoy this panel. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I have so many non-resident fellowships. Well, I have a new affiliation as well. I'm now a non-resident senior fellow at the Arizona State University Threatcasting Lab, along with this fine crew. So it's my pleasure here to welcome you all to our session. This panel discussion is basically going to be a sort of introduction to the workshop we'll be hosting at 3:30, where you can take theory, as we're discussing now, and apply it into practice with us. So it's my pleasure here to have, as members of the Threatcasting Lab, the two principals, Cyndi Coon here on my immediate right, at the far end, Brian David Johnson, and in between, we have Cyndi Winkelman, who's sort of the creative director of the lab, and Buck Owens, who, well, Buck's our storyteller-in-chief, I guess, for this session particularly. So it's a pleasure to be here. We're going to spend the next, certainly the next hour, and I will, of course, welcome any questions here. I'm not one to stand and force you into 5 minutes of questions at the end, so we'll integrate your thoughts into halfway through. But we're really going to sort of talk about this discipline of threat casting, and I guess I want to start with, we'll start with you, BDJ, quickly. I'm going to put the same question to you that the very nice woman from Dallas PBS put to me, which is, describe threat casting in 3 sentences. If I can do it for public television, you can do it too.
Well, I'm also all for efficiencies. You could just do it if you've already done it. So, hey everybody, and scene. So threat casting is a methodology that looks 10 years out into the future based on interdisciplinary inputs, models a range of possible and potential futures, and then backcast and say, how do we disrupt, mitigate, and recover from that threat? And then also, what are the flags, what are the indicators along the way over the next 10 years that are showing that this threat is beginning to manifest?
Now, in conjunction with that, and BJ, I'll let you take it again, is in practice, it's combined with science fiction prototyping. So for those of you familiar with the discipline of foresight, there are many, many schools. Typically, it gets rendered as a 2x2 matrix where we graph out some variables and plot out scenarios, which are typically dry and discarded from there. But the thing I like about threat casting is its specificity. And why is that?
So it's very specific because we believe that these scenarios and sort of traditional tools of foresight are necessary but not sufficient for the 21st century, that we need a level of detail, specifically if we're defining a certain space so that we can defend it, especially as we look at global disinformation, as we look at AI, as we look at a lot of the infrastructure attacks that might be coming up. These are far too complex. And so if we get into the details of the definition, then we can better defend it and we can better track it. And so what sci-fi prototyping allows us to do is actually look at a person in a place experiencing this threat, because who you are and where you are when it comes to these types of threat really, really matters. And certainly the pandemic has taught us that, but lots of other things have shown us that. And when we do it, and much like if you come to the workshop after this, you will experience it, we have small groups who do multiple times. So we look at a person in a place experiencing a threat from multiple different perspectives. So we have a much broader data set. Then as we start to think about how do we disrupt, mitigate, and recover from it, we've got many more indicators, we have many more second and third order effects that might come out of it, and we have a lot more actions that can be taken. And really, science fiction prototyping is science fiction based on science fact, thinking about a person in place experiencing the threat, that really allows that narrative thinking to give us a much more well-rounded and detailed view.
Thank you. I was going to say, for those of you who are curious about trying it, I like to describe threatcasting as basically sitting around and sketching out the outlines of Black Mirror episodes, and then sort of taking them all together and then surfacing the themes out of it.
And that was our code name for this project that we've been doing all week at the conference. Is we've called it Black Mirror in an hour. So that's what we're going to do after this, is Black Mirror in 1 hour.
Excellent. Well, Cyndi, I want to get into this too, because obviously when we talk about this, you always put the emphasis on the human, and that's one of the things. The other thing I like about threat casting, besides the narrative specifics, which we'll come back to, is this relentless grounding of the person versus abstract variables into that. And why is that so important, and how does that manifest in the final output when it comes to actually predicting these threats and doing the backcast?
Thanks, Greg. I don't know if is this working? Yeah, I'm on. Okay, so First of all, because the future is designed by everyone. You cannot design a place without everyone's voice included. So the core center of everything we're doing connects back to humans now, humans in the future. And so the entire process is kind of like an empathy hack. It's a way to sit in the place of a person, imagining them experiencing something horrific, and then you working really, really hard as a participant to walk it back to make sure it never happens. That journey, that process continuously brings it back to the focus of why we're all here and what we're all doing. Because sometimes we can get veering off on the seduction of technology or whatever thematic thing we're looking at, but at the core, the reason we're doing it is for the human beings. And so built in to the methodology is the link right on back to human beings.
Excellent. All right, and then when it comes to visualizing this, the other thing that sort of sets threat casting apart, at least is how it's done, is particularly the range of outputs. And so, Cyndi, I want to go to you on this one, which is for all those who are seeing the excellent swag tables outside, you'll see there's a pile of comic books and graphic novels, and not just reports gathering dust, 150-page PDFs that that no one reads except AIs. Cyndi, can you talk a bit about sort of the range of outputs you've worked with as part of the team, and why it resonates to particularly get that in a visual form that people can understand, and what really resonates with people in terms of being able to communicate these threats and teach them?
Well, Brian came to me a long time ago. We actually talked about doing this, and the SFP has always fascinated me just because it's science fiction for one thing. But then when I found out that the Army has been using graphic novels and comic books since World War II to repair Jeeps because people couldn't read, I was just blown away. Will Eisner was part of that, and it's just like, to continue that is a really cool thing, and to be working for the Army doing that just was great for me. To be honest, it's just like a true dream to be, when I think about my 7-year-old self looking at myself now being like, I'm making graphic novels for a living, and they're dark. Like, it's not, it's so cool to me. And they apparently are effective because it's just like, it's a visual medium that you can get the gist of it really quickly and not have to read a 500-page report. And it seems to get people excited and interested to read the report and to do more.
Excellent. All right, well, then that gets to the final piece of that, Buck. I'm curious, you're, as the member on stage here, not in the government capacity, but has spent time in this, who spent time trying to convince leadership of the importance of this. What is so important about the fact of telling it as a story versus telling it as a 2x2 or set of bullet points or a set of scenarios? Where is the real power in this method lie as far as you're concerned, and in terms of how you can use it to communicate these threats?
Yeah, thanks. So I think you described pretty typical foresight work as this 2x2, and you create 4 plausible futures. And I've done a few of the workshops, and I think at some point, maybe it was the second time I was part of the analysis team, and we get into the real, like the juicy stuff and the darkness, and there's always this moment where we have this epiphany where we say, well, we really found something here. And that moment, I think, or at least the argument I'm making, is that moment gets lost when the participant leaves the workshop and their boss says, so what do you do at this threat casting thing? And so at some point, everyone has like the hill they want to die on. I created my own hill. I piled up a bunch of dirt and I said, that's the hill I want to die on. And my enemy is a PowerPoint slide with 4 bullets that you give a senior leader, and you want them to be briefed on something, and futures and foresight and threats are very complex. And I don't want that. I don't think that is compelling enough for a senior leader to realize the real thing that these cohorts are developing, cohorts of subject matter experts. And so I started playing around with that idea and started sending some samples to the rest of the team, and nobody told me to stop, so I kept going, and then I ended up here with a project to work on.
We'll delve back into that project. But first, so those of you who are going to attend the workshop, you'll get a taste for it, and we'll come to it in a moment. Actually, what the workshop following this is going to be a more rapid iteration of rapid threat casting. Typically, in rapid threat casting, you sketch out the stories. There's a rapid post analysis, and you and then surface out the ideas. Here, we're going to be using. We can talk a bit about this. Some generative AI tools to basically make it even faster. But before we get to that, Brian, I'd love to hear your thoughts. What does the typical threat casting exercise entail? Who do you want to participate in it to make sure you capture this range of perspectives? And what is the sort of typical output? And I just want to flag that past workshops you've done, you've had Chris Claremont, writer of the X-Men, Max Brooks, son of Mel, who actually is part of the Atlantic Council as well, and others. And there's some interesting wild cards in this. But what are you trying to identify for when you get those people in the room? Who do you want in the room and why?
So generally when we do it, it is about 1 to 2 days, usually about 5 to 8 hours per day, depending upon who's doing it, because it's an applied method, right? We're not doing capital F futures. We're doing it for a specific area. We're doing it for NATO. We're doing it for the Air Force. We're doing it for the Army. And so in that way, we're making sure that it's not only we're designing these futures, but they're going to be applied. And so that's really important. So the length of time really matters there. Generally, it's between 30 and 70 people that we gather together. The largest one I've ever done is about 250 people. I don't recommend it. You have to have like an army of futurists running around. We had a closed circuit television going. So we did that. And we get them together, but the whole idea goes back to Cyndi about the people. And it's about getting a diversity of people there. And when I say diversity, it is certainly a diversity of gender and of ethnicity, but it's also of age. We generally have everybody from, we've had 2-star generals down to undergraduates. And basically, we've had an undergraduate sitting next to a 2-star general. And what's really funny is the undergraduate is freaked out, and the general thinks it's the coolest thing on earth. Because basically, the undergraduate will tell them the truth. And if you've ever briefed out a general, oftentimes it's just 4 bullet points instead of some crazy sci-fi nerd who's talking to you about what these futures could be. And so we're always trying to get people with different domains as well. And one of the things that is Cyndi's art is being able to curate those people, to look at them beforehand. And what we generally do is we create to get a little nerdy, we create a seat matrix. So it's not just saying, okay, these are the people we want to have in the room. We've actually built in this notion of functional diversity where we actually allocate seats. So we say we want an African-American female engineer. We want a person identifying of Asian descent who is a writer. So we'll go through and actually do that, and then we'll fill the seats. And if a seat doesn't get filled, that's bad for us, and that remains not filled. And we actually, as a requirement, I'm a systems engineer, as a requirement, we have failed. And that's okay, but we know we need to fill that in some other way. So we're trying to kind of really instrument diversity because we know, and there's plenty of Nobel Prize winners and plenty of scientists that will tell you, is that the more diverse your inputs, the stronger your ecosystem, the stronger your model. And so we've taken that to heart, and especially when Cyndi and I founded the lab at ASU, that became a bedrock of it, that this is the way that we are going to approach it. And it's paid dividends not only in the fact that the outputs are really kind of interesting and work, but then it creates this atmosphere. And when I say it, I mean Cyndi. Cyndi creates this atmosphere for people where they're in these small groups and they really knuckle in. And again, hopefully this is a big pitch for coming. And by the way, I can see all of you. And so if you're not there, I see you. But the idea of saying, getting them in those small groups, you really are into it. I mean, you are literally building the future. And especially when we're doing it, because again, we are going to turn this into a report, we're going to turn it into Sci-Fi prototypes, we're actually take this so people really do get passionate because they realize they really are building the future. And down to the work that I do with Cyndi and that we do in the lab, and we're actually going to show the future to people. It's not this abstract thing anymore. It's this very visceral, and it really, Buck talks about it all the time. It makes it super compelling and it hits you in the gut and you look at it and you understand that this is a big deal. And really it's that the notion of diversity in all those viewpoints gets us to a richness so that we can do all those things.
All right, well, I'm going to go to Buck next on this one. So the title of the session is actually for Buck's contribution to the program, and it says it there too, these stories to making it compelling. So if you come to join the workshop, you'll get to do this with us. I say last time I was here at UT was for one that Buck and BJ were running on micro-targeting, which Jason mentioned earlier as well. Buck, what is it like to write these stories? So for the next stage of this, so if you get the people in the room, what is it like when you're sitting down with your group and you're trying to basically sketch this out? What does it entail and what are you trying to get to?
I think at the highest level, I want to elicit a response in the reader, right? I want to get away from that succinct fact, next slide. I want them to react to it, and I think everyone here can do that, right? I believe that that is possible. Anyone who participates in a workshop can go back and elicit a response. So I'm experimenting with that. And that response could be, oh, wow, that makes me nervous, which is sometimes what we do when we read these things. We think, wow, that is so good, I'm frightened. It could be a senior leader or decision maker could read that scenario and say, wow, I actually think we're positioned for that better than our competitor. Well, that's pretty good too. Or the response could be, I have more questions. How did you get this in a 3-day workshop? So that's what I want. And I think that that's what we can do better for our leaders and decision makers. If you're investing the time to go to a workshop, come back with something that elicits a response from the decision maker at your organization, because they deserve that, and you know that they need that.
Yeah. Yes, Brian. I'm calling on you. Go ahead.
Thank you, Professor Lindsay. So one of the other things that Cyndi and I get all the time, which is exactly what Buck is saying. A perfect example is, so Cyndi and I, and this is not classified, you can actually find this, we did a graphic novella looking at the intersection of emerging disruptive technologies and weapons of mass destruction, and what that might do was for NATO. And we ended up writing this story around how it might happen with a rogue nation and how they could use all these emerging disruptive technologies and how they could launch a couple of tactical nuclear devices into the middle of the United States. When we first presented it to the people we were working with, we made a colonel in the United States Army gasp. And we were like, yes!
Success. That is success. Well, I will go to Cyndi on that one then too. So it's part of the methodology. So you get the people in the room, you write the stories, as you'll see, where you basically are given parameters and you write them out, and then there's a post-analysis where on the back end it's all sort of collated, and then it's distilled, or the stories will be turned into that. And so, Cyndi, I'm curious, if you could explain then what happens at that step here, where it's like the selecting of the stories, building out the creative assets. How do you take the stories, the sketches of these stories that are there, and then deepen them? I know Brian often writes them, but I don't want to hear from him right now. So how do you actually art direct that, or choose which stories to be like, this is illustrative of the findings, because it has to go back to the findings as well.
Right. It's kind of tricky, actually. I mean, I like to listen in on the workshops when I can to sort of see how these ideas come to fruition, and then I will think about them for a while, and then once I hear the entire thing and know what we're talking about, I try to use a filmmaker's mind and like try to visualize a screenplay of these things and the different layouts and the visuals. And then, of course, Brian will write the stories, and that he'll put in his ideas, his descriptions as well. And it helps for me to just kind of focus in on how the shot should look and what it needs to be and the direction it needs to take. But lately, we've been using the generative AI to get even more focused on it, which has been an amazing tool, just to kind of refine things, and comes up with different ideas that I never would have thought of, just from a storyboard standpoint and just creatively. And it's interesting to use that as a tool to go deeper. But it has its limitations. I mean, sometimes it comes with really absurd stuff that just doesn't make any sense at all. So there's a lot of editing involved and focused work to make it pinpoint what you need it to be. It's not as easy as a lot of people think.
I don't think anyone thinks it easy, especially Cyndi here. I'm going to come back to this. So you've heard this. So this is a methodology that's basically practiced by like the 4 people on stage here. And to the extent here that Cyndi and I worked on a project last summer that entailed her spending 3 months traveling around rural Arizona in person to run these workshops, underscores how hard it can be to scale up this amazing practice for this. So hence the use of AI. And so Cyndi, I was hoping you could talk a bit about this, but why pulling AI tools into this? Why trying to make it even more rapid in pursuit of what? Democratizing the tool, scaling it up? Like what are the aims here for the methodology that we're going to test with you all in just a little bit?
Yes. There's BDJ and I. And then there's some folks here who have been trained, and has trained a lot of students and a lot of people, but they are working places. Everyone who has this training is working somewhere. So one of the things is it's a method that needs to be used by more people. So the tool that we're working on while we're here allows more people to engage in this method. It allows the whole thing to scale without us having to be in the room. So then it can go anywhere. In democratizing it, it allows anyone who can have access to this tool to run these kind of exercises to get insight without having to wait for us in the whole long journey process of, it's a lot of hand labor right now. Our analysis takes us, it's us. So it's a long journey. So these tools, what we're really trying to do is get folks to understand the pieces of the method, but also to play in the space of imagination. The reason the generative AI works for what our end game is it's not about the participants being in the room, getting it exactly right. It's about how weird can shit get. And if you can get that weird, the adversary can get that weird. And if AI makes you get weirder than you meant to get, great. Because everyone can get AI. So if the AI can pump out with the adversary some weird mashup of wild behavior, then we need to know. And the reason we need to know, we have a saying that I say all the time. The humans are the problem in every case. And the humans are the solution. Because if we can all think about this stuff and get weird about it, we're doing better, we're saving lives, everything's getting better. And that's the point of the AI is it doesn't have to be us. It just has to be get the creative muscle going in a direction it doesn't normally go.
Excellent. Well put. I would say my addition to that, Cyndi, was a few years ago when Dr. Gregory Treverton was still the chairman of the NIC and was giving a public-ish talk at the Council on Foreign Relations. Someone had asked him, like, how do we get better at long-term thinking? And to which I added onto that, how do we get better at weird thinking, Dr. Treverton? How do you inculcate weirdness into organizations? And before we come back to that in a moment, I want to go around quickly about, obviously, how threat casting has manifested weird thinking relevant, of course, to the conference at hand. So I'm going to call upon each of you. We'll start with BDJ and then come back around here in just a moment. And I'll go first so you can think about it for a second. But I would love a story outline or two that really you thought got to the heart of this or was able to surface that was novel. Two that I've worked on. One was an outlier out of micro-targeting. I believe it was a story that germinated from Buck, actually, which was we sat around being like, how would we fake a school shooting? And that's the kind of conversations I love having at these events. And then the reason, of course, why would you fake a school shooting? And of course, the reason why you would fake a school shooting would be to further frack away any shared belief system. So the next time an Alex Jones figure claims a false flag and crisis actors, well, now you would actually have precedent to point to. So you would do it to destroy more consensus reality. And the other one I love from the weapons of mass destruction report that I worked on with Brian was the finding that simulated long-term effects of WMDs. You could use emerging technologies to slowly degrade a nation. And we were writing this report at the time when there was a lot of conspiracy talk about America's food processing factories burning down. Charlie Kirk of Turning Point and others were pointing it out. And it was that moment I realized that, like, yes, this will look like a conspiracy theory, that a long-term attack by an adversary using EDTs will resemble conspiracy theories. So you can sort of see this way it surfaces these odd connections. Brian, do you have a highlight or two?
So I have two. There's one that I use with my students. So again, we don't think we've said this yet, so that when we're doing threat casting, right, we're not predicting the future. We are modeling a range of possible and potential futures so that we can come up with a framework for making decisions. So we're not prediction, it's the idea of the range of the possible and the potential, and sometimes the impossible and moving backwards and being able to figure that out. But with that said, many years ago, I think it was 2016, 2017, we were starting to doing work with the Army Cyber Institute and some other folks looking at the intersection between weaponizing AI and sort of thinking about that. We did one where we were looking at information warfare and what that would look like on sort of average citizens. Obviously, the GDL has sort of done a lot of work in that. And we started coming up with this thing called information disorder machines, which was this idea of just using AI and ML to be able to come up with basically stories and disinformation, misinformation, and information disorder and point it at people and be able to use reflexive control to get them to do things. And again, this is 2016, 2017. And when we so we described this, and this was one of the holy crap moments when I sort of saw its potential, and we did the backcasting. And on page 38, of that report was to say one of the indicators, one of the flags, was when a public release of an AI ML tool that can be used by people to look at large amounts of content and create custom content for people. Usually people gasp. If you want to gasp, go ahead.
ChatGPT is so old school, Brian.
I know,
it's always been around. I can't imagine a time before.
I can't remember a time that,
No.
I don't know, a year and a half ago.
Yeah.
But that idea of saying for us, it wasn't a prediction, it was saying, okay, now that this has happened, it is an indicator, we now know what to do next. We now know what to do next. So for me, that is literally very much a textbook version of what we do. Another one gets back to, I think, what you were saying, Greg, around weirdness is certainly back in 2020, myself being a professor at ASU, it means I serve for the university. I also serve the state of Arizona. They brought us in to do COVID modeling. I worked with a mathematical epidemiologist by the name of Tim Lant, and we were doing modeling for COVID. We were looking 1 month, 3 months, 6 months, 8 months out around what it might be and what it might mean to civil and civic decision makers. So mayors and different people in the business thing. And so what Dr. Lant would tell you was that he's really good at modeling morbidity and mortality and hospital rates. And he said he can do that. He goes, but what I can't model is crazy. And BDJ can model crazy. Threat casting models crazy. And then once we've modeled crazy, then we can turn it into near-term and mid-term quantitative measures of what that means. And so there's this great mirroring and I think a great case study of how that was done. And as we move through, in an awful way, but threat casting often has awful successes. The awful success was that they held, and they held they held for over 2 years, that what we were monitoring and what we were going through. So that was one of the ones, to me, to your point of somebody going, how they were functionally using it. And what ended up happening is it was not only used in Arizona, it was picked up and used in the western states as well. So I live in Oregon. It was used in Oregon as well to make decisions about what the people should do during the pandemic.
Thank you. Cyndi.
Well, the one that stands out for me is, I think it was the first workshop I ever went to. I was part of the moderators, and we had a group of tankers and Army tankers, and we had to have them discuss what's the worst thing that could happen to you. And it's all about vulnerability with the workshop and threat casting, and a lot of people don't really dig to bring out what is the thing that scares them the most. And I don't know anything about tanks. I don't know anything about tankers and all this. But these guys did it. I mean, they told us that the worst thing that could happen was be stuck in a tank that's turned upside down. And I'd never thought of that. It was terrifying, beautifully terrifying for what we do. And we had to come up with a scenario to put a tank in that position. And it was fascinating to me that they were able to just give us that information, and then we were able to create something that they could be in that position. But more so, it's just that, which we don't get a lot in the workshops, is the vulnerability. It's people don't open up enough about what it is that scares them. Everybody kind of plays it safe. But to see that on firsthand, I was just blown away. And that's when I knew that this means something. This works. This can work if it's done right.
Great. Buck.
So the question was, what was like the...
Pull out 1 or 2 examples. I think it's particularly germane, obviously, to the topic of the
Yeah.
conference, the core of it.
So a couple of years ago, we were doing the micro-targeting threat casting, and the report's out there. You can read some of this out there in the report if there's any copies left. We were in the analysis stage. We were going through what the cohorts were writing, and we were trying to figure out what do we want to include in the final report. Not give all the detail, but sort of like as a reference, here's some examples of things. And one of them was a scenario called Private Jane's Secrets. And just high-level summary, it was a future state where the idea of suicide in social media actually becomes popular after the normalization of mental health, and people can talk about mental health. And without going into all the details, it ended with her announcing to her followers she was going to commit suicide online, and then she committed suicide online. And so there's two things about that, to answer your question. One was, at the time, I was experimenting with turning these vignettes into news articles and see how that feels. And I was sending them around to other members of the team. There was one about the false flag shooting. And that one I actually could not write. It just was too, like, I just felt it was uncomfortable. So I thought, well, maybe I'll turn that into like a high-level report that a general would read, like an after-action report. I never really finished it. And then BDJ did say, and Cyndi said, this is not intended to be predictive work. 2 weeks ago, I sent a disturbing email to the crowd, and I said, did you see the news article about the young airman who committed suicide by lighting himself on fire in Washington, D.C.? Some news stations ran with that, and some didn't, and it didn't really go viral on YouTube, and that was curious. And I was disturbed because we are not intending to be predictive. But when sometimes you're tracking the trend so well that there's an element, not the whole thing, but just the element of it, it is physically disturbing because you don't want to brag about that. And so I sent an email to the crew going, I don't know how I feel about this. And none of these people even acknowledged my email except for Jason Brown, who's like, it's okay, Buck, everything. No, don't now. But like that was a weird moment for me because that's not our intention, right? We don't want to brag and go, hey, remember 10 years ago we were right? You don't want to be right about that. And so that's that. It was hard. And it still is. I don't know what to do with we can't brag about that.
Well said. And that was you were a mensch, Jason. That was a very nice note you sent around. Cyndi.
I just want to say a super quick thing about that, I think, before I jump into mine, which is BDJ and I both get asked a lot, how are you guys so optimistic? Because we are both extremely optimistic. And the email response probably didn't happen because it's part of the reason we can stay so optimistic is because we get to do this work and we get to see it working. So while it's really hard that things happen and those are our flags and those are our gates and real life things happen, but we can stay upright in it and stay really positive because we also know the work is being done, so all kinds of things aren't happening. So I just wanted to address that really quick. So mine that I would pick is probably the example I use the most often, which isn't really a story, but is a kind of bigger thing that really sits with me actually every single day. So in 2020, 2021, I did some work with some research around an area called Cool Abilities that Vint Cerf handed over to me, and I did that with some partners at the UN. And it's formerly disabling conditions, now seen as superpowers. And that project, we had participants from all over the world virtually, and the level of input from participants was really incredible, even though it was virtual, and it moved needles on things that were just incredible to witness. Here's the thing about this. There was a woman whose name is Tina Navarro at the UN Innovation Lab in Finland, which I think has a different name now. And she was a participant, and after it was over, we did a follow-up. And she said to me, "That was awesome. That was incredible. Loved it all." And then she said, "You know, this is really great work, and you're kind of hoarding it over there. What are you going to do to get this out into the world?" I think about that woman's comment every single day. I can't get it out of my head. And it's because she saw the value in her innovation lab of how can more people learn how to do this. So since then, I've been on a mission to take it around the world, because I think the people who see what it can do and benefit, it's like it's then a responsibility. So that's what I think about more than any scenario we've ever built, any model. It is that woman, Tina Navarro, in my head.
Excellent. Well, I would say I should note that I do sleep very well at night, to the point that you and Brian are optimists. I do sleep very well at night, but that's because I emigrated to Canada, so that helps.
If I could, I feel like I left us in a dark moment, but
Yes.
you mentioned about how do we become optimistic? Well, we look at this pragmatically, and so in that particular scenario where we thought that might be a potential future, we would now go back and talk about gates and flags. And now we could say, okay, that potential future, we might be leaning in that direction. What are the mitigations? And maybe the mitigations were the ones I just said, like it didn't pick up a lot of media attention. So maybe that's the mitigation. And we, as not being optimists, but pragmatists, saying, well, okay, so maybe that future will be diverted and not pursued because of one particular act.
All right, well, let's go back to that question for you and BDJ, and then I'll open it up to audience questions. We can keep going from there. But I want to challenge you in that one. So going back to the earlier point there about bullets to beliefs, to inculcating that, what are your examples of real-world impacts from this methodology in terms of it actually manifesting, where they actually paid attention and they actually went back to the gates and actually implemented or went back to the flags and the gates, went back to the flags, seeing the flags, and intervened at a gate to actually stop it from happening or to present an alternate future?
So I do a lot of work with national and global security. I should do a lot of work in the private sector. And so one of the areas that has been very, very public in the private sector is I do this type of work for MasterCard. So we work with MasterCard doing yearly threat casting, looking at global and international threats from criminals and nation states and what those attacks might look like. They have been very public about us going and doing this, and then they have what's called a Global Fusion Center. And the Global Fusion Center, if you don't know, Fusion Centers could have came out of 9/11. It's where all the information comes together. The threats that we are identifying actually get piped directly into the Fusion Center. So every year, their list of what they're tracking year over year over year is grows by this. And so they have the ability to identify it and flag it. And they've talked about different things that have happened when we were doing COVID, different things that have happened. They've gone public around sort of attacks on their satellites, attacks on satellites when the war in Ukraine happened. There's all sorts of examples along the way where they have not only taken action because they put it in and they actively trying to stop it and identify it early, but then when they do have that initial attack, that they actually have already explored it and they can pull it down and start looking at recovery plans. And so much of what we do is to guard against strategic surprise. And that's sort of one of the big areas.
Well, as a quick follow-up to that then, what are the hallmarks of highly successful organizations like a MasterCard that is able to actually guard against strategic surprise? Because I always think of this as, every year the WEF, right before Davos, comes out with its list of short-term and long-term global threats, and the cognitive dissonance is off the charts. It's all gray rhinos. I could tell you climate-induced mass migration. They know it's going to happen, and yet there's blindness. How do you take this and inculcate it? How do you instill it into them where it becomes second nature to them? Are there any lessons from what it takes from leadership at MasterCard or others to do that?
Well, I think there's two areas. One is having an organization that understands the output, like what is the problem we're solving, and that they're empowered to take action. So you have this going to a certain office, a certain area, a certain person who is empowered to then go sort of solve that problem, to go and do it. And so it's understanding that it's not an intellectual endeavor. It's not something that you are very specifically solving a problem that can be tracked. And one of my students who was going through and interviewing people, their question was, why do you do threat casting the third time around? Right? When people are doing it is because they're actually seeing the benefit and plugging it into doing it. So oftentimes it's having an organization that has the ability to do the sensing, to do the monitoring, and then is empowered to kind of take the action. But another example to take from the federal government is we did a threat casting for DTRA, the Defense Threat Reduction Agency, looking at and this was around 2018, 2019, looking at the equivalent of a digital weapon of mass destruction. They were really good at nuclear They're pretty good at bio, and they were saying, well, what on the cyber? They don't know that. What should they do? And so they asked for two very specific things. One was, can you just describe what a digital weapon of mass destruction might look like? Because nobody has really described what they are. There's no definitive sort of definition of it, so we aggregated it together and said, it might look something like this. But the second thing they asked for was the most important part. Who should we be talking to? They're like, we know who to talk to in these other swim lanes. We have no idea who to partner with. So by going out and saying, this is what that threat could look like, and then backcasting to say, okay, here are the people you should be talking to, here are the people you should go. So we gave them a roadmap to then go out and start talking to different folks at different agencies in different areas.
Great. Buck, you have a classic example of this from the Coast Guard, I believe, on this, in terms of actually implementing long-term planning.
So the Coast Guard still runs what's called Project Evergreen, CG51, I think is the office. And I was fortunate enough before I retired to kind of get in their circle as well. And they do a similar model, a scenario-based planning, where they do that 4 quadrants that you were talking about. And about a decade ago, they were thinking as an organization, they came out with about 20 different topics and trends that they thought were impacting that particular branch of the military. And out of that, they were like, well, that's too many. They came down to, I don't know how, I wasn't part of that, but they came down to what will the Arctic look like if the Northwest Passage is open for shipping year-round? Now, that might be seen as a global warming question, but they didn't approach it that way. They just looked at it from their mission set. What will that look like? And blah, 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 a lot of work, a lot of phenomenal work with the diversity of the workforce coming in. And there are many outputs of that, and one of them is also, at the same time, all the icebreakers, which, by the way, the United States only owns a handful of icebreakers. It's not the Navy, it's only the Coast Guard. They knew they needed to rebuild the ones from the 70s. They were too old. And what does foresight look like? The ones they're launching now are not called polar cutters. They're called polar security cutters. They now know, as an organization, we must provide some sort of law enforcement if the Northwest Passage is open to shipping. So that was like an actual behavior that I would say comes out of just the idea of foresight. And the other one was they were the first organization I believe, in the United States to reach out to all the other nations that have a slice of the Arctic, China, Sweden, I can't remember all the others, Canada, and said, hey, do you want to get together and have a conference about this? Right? They didn't wait for this. They actually developed, which I thought was pretty sophisticated, a relationship with the other people who have a say or an opinion of what the Northwest Passage would look like. So those were, again, I'm kind of like we were talking about this earlier in our team, like military people, we like to think, we like to talk, but at some point we want to put metal down range. We want to do something. And so that to me was like, okay, those are behaviors that can be traced back to not necessarily threat casting, but the idea of being foresight professionals. And I was really thrilled at that.
All right. Well, we have 15 minutes left. I got more questions, but does anyone have questions who would like to intervene with this?
And why people think they're questions, I just want to point out, did you see that humble Coast Guard brag that just happened?
Yeah,
right
that was good.
That was really good. That was a brag. Oh, yeah.
All right. Well, if you think of questions, you just let me know. I hope you're getting ready for our workshop. I want to go to Cyndi real fast on this, and then back to Cyndi. Cyndi, I want to ask you, in terms of the scaling aspect of what we're about to do with the AI stuff, how do you imagine inculcating this expertise into more organizations? Like, how should we go about the education and scaling of this? Because, I think honestly, in most cases, organizations with foresight units they're often isolated, siloed. They don't have the ear of leadership. How do you think that the potential democratization of threat casting and other foresight techniques like this, with the aid of AI tools or otherwise, could start to change that?
I think it's like a BDJ and Cyndi in a kit that what has to happen for it to be effective, I think is what's more important, is the infusion of the pieces that are really important. Because the reason there are 50-some foresight tools, that many of them are games and are fun, but standalone, they're just that. And, we wrote the book so anyone can do it. But what you have to have is you have to have someone who has the facilitation skills and knowledge to stay focused on the human, focused on the human. So creating this tool and us all as a team co-creating it and infusing it with personality so that it has a constant, a shift. It can grow, it can change. As new things come in, new things can come in. So if tools like Sora come, we can have quick exercises like this where we can pop out little videos, because the most important thing is this methodology, because it's content agnostic, it can be used in tiny versions, it can be used in big versions. So if you have folks like us who are trained and we're doing real deep dives for a year with someone, that's one version. But you can do the same thing with a smaller of anything you're up to. And that's what I'm looking forward to, is more people having the opportunity to engage in the opportunity to gaze into the future, figure out what they need to do, even if it's for themselves. Come on back and do it. That's what's exciting about it.
Great. And then building off that point there with mention of Sora and similar tools, Cyndi, I'm curious. I mean, you described a film as thinking of it as creating a film before, which of course like sort of implies auteur theory, that, like, you know, the central creative director. What excites you about the potential democratization of those tools as well in terms of co-creation with people? Like, so for example, I mostly think about cities is my sort of main area of focus. And the thing about generative AI that struck me immediately was as a tool for community and civic engagement, where now you can sit down and ask people, what would you like to see in your city? And like text to images. Now we can start generating stuff together and you can instantly create that. I'm curious, is there a similar function for that when it comes to threat casting and sci-fi prototyping in terms of, getting people to iterate much more quickly and more deeply, which I think is what we'll be doing very shortly. But your thoughts?
Yeah, with the generative AI, we've been able to, well, let me go back. In the past, we've used regular artists, graphic novel artists, comic book artists, and there's a lot of back and forth, and it takes weeks to get something done. And with the generative AI, I realized we've been able to, it's also a pain in the ass to ask an artist, a graphic novel artist, to draw critical infrastructure in the city. They don't like drawing pipes and like electrical lines and, sewage stuff like that. But generative AI will do whatever you want it to do, and it'll do it in detail. And so it's been a game changer for me to use it to just create imagery on the fly quickly and not have to go back and forth and waste time and come up with imagery and videos and whatnot that look real, are effective, and create an emotional response with people immediately, because a lot of it's really realistic. I mean, it's beyond being just art, and you can make it look like a photograph, and it's believable, and it just hits that much harder. And then taking that imagery and then now starting to animate it and create video works even faster and creates emotional response with the audience faster as well. And then adding music and sound effects and dialogue, it's better than a graphic novel and quicker, and you can watch it within 2 minutes and you just digest it real quickly, and it's effective.
Excellent. All right. Any questions yet? No? Oh, come on. Should be such an inquisitive crowd. Well, I want to get then, going from there then is, let's see where we go. Examples, is that there? Well, I guess I want to get back, Cyndi, your thoughts on this as well then. I want to take the same question and throw it back then. Obviously, because you spent that time going to rural groups in Arizona, and I would love to hear your thoughts on, obviously, it's one thing when you have expert practitioners, it's another thing when you have community practitioners. What are your hopes for scaling that tool or getting more normal voices in the room? And by normal, I mean non-people with titles and credentials.
Well, since no one's asking questions and I have the mic, I'll tell you about my dream. So
You got 9 minutes. Floor is yours.
These guys are like, here we go. No, I really do have a dream about how this could be super democratized, which is I have this idea for Sunday night threat night on Twitch, and with a platform that can run and can be set up really quickly, hundreds of people could come in. A sponsor can say, I'm not looking for you guys to do your deep dive research. I don't need your analysis. I just need some scenarios for our team to kind of get cooking on something, which all of us get asked to do all the time separately from running a full threatcast. So that's a common ask. But wouldn't it be fun if, in the process of NATO just needing a handful of things to riff on, we let people who wanted to come in and experience this, because, you know, folks often ask us, how do you get people in the room? How do you do that? And I always say, I have a wait list at all times. The reason there's a wait list is because it's fun. It is humans being creative, dealing with important things, using imagination. And so if we could create this tool so that we are not required, we could have so many people engage in this. And even if you came once, spent 3 hours on a weekend learning it, playing, because it can be very gamified, then you walk away, even if you never come back, you have that mindset now. Because the biggest thing that makes changes is to change the mindset. And that's what this work does, because it builds in empathy in your thoughts. It builds in permission for vulnerability, permission for creativity in your practice, that, you know, you can take off your khaki pants business town attitude and really dive in. So that's what I see in the long range, because Cyndi and BDJ aren't going to do this forever, and there has to be a way for folks to have access. And right now the access is limited because there's so few of us, and even if you pick up the book, it's like, oh my God, this feels like a lot. It's really process heavy, because it is, because it's a method. So if we can turn it into something that everyone can have access to, and ultimately, some way, somehow, down the road, this isn't coming. This is Cyndi's dream. But that's what I'm thinking about.
It's important to have dreams, Cyndi. Thank you. All right, so having listened to this last hour, how many of you are excited to join us in the workshop coming right up? I want to see show of hands. Who's coming? Who's game? I got some good hands here. All right, we got 6 minutes left. Unless you got any questions, I'm going to throw one more question here to BDJ, which is, sir, any advice for our participants here? Obviously, I'm sure we'll go through instructions in a moment here, but we'd love to hear your thoughts on, like, you know, what spirit, what mindset should they bring to this, and particularly start thinking about how to psych themselves up here.
Well, I think the number one most underutilized tool when it comes to modeling and threat casting and future casting and national security and things like that is the imagination. We all have it. And we need to use it. Nothing great was ever built by people that wasn't imagined first. And one of the most powerful things which we've all talked about here is not only imagining by yourself, but imagining with groups. That's where, much like the quote about cities are where ideas go to have sex, I think this type of is very similar, that you really start working together. You can do what you want in your group, but the idea being that it's that interplay between people, so you need to be open and be curious, that notion of being curious, and to allow yourself to have crazy ideas. To Cyndi's point, I mean, that's one of the things, and even back to one of the things that I did in the past is I ran a lab at the Intel Corporation, and we had a dumb, crazy idea fund that we used to reward people for crazy ideas. If people had dumb ideas, and we'd say, oh, Sally, that was a stinker, here you go. Or, wow, that was nuts, right? Here you go. And the reason why is we knew that a crazy idea is only crazy until somebody finds out it's genius. And that happens all the time. And especially, and then what we say functionally is that, right, the only way to get to the edge of the possible is to go into the impossible. So I think it's give yourself that permission. You have a platform, a literal platform across there to be able to do that with groups of people, but to give yourself the permission to really push yourself, because ultimately, by being a little crazy and a little weird, you're actually making the world safer. And that's pretty awesome.
All right. Well, on that note, we're going to adjourn this 4 minutes early. Can I get a round of applause for our panelists? Thank you so much. And thank you so much for joining us. All right. Well, I bid you all, it's time for the workshop. So I bid you all to come up, get up, exit out here, and join us in the threat casting room, which is around to the right. And let's get casting.